You know, some battles in history are just footnotes, little skirmishes that don't really move the needle. But others? Others rewrite the history books entirely. Today we're talking about one of those, the Battle of Tsushima. This was the single most decisive naval battle of the modern age. A clash that didn't just sink ships, it shattered empires and literally changed the world.
And it all starts with a single number, 18,000. That's how many nautical miles the Russian fleet had to sail just to show up to the fight. We're talking halfway around the globe, an incredible 7-month-long journey.
And let's be clear, this was no grand tour. This was an act of pure desperation. This fleet was sailing from the Baltic all the way to the Pacific to try and save Russia from a totally humiliating defeat. Honestly, their fate was pretty much sealed before a single cannon was even fired.
So, to really get why the battle went down the way it did, you first have to understand this unbelievable journey. It was a 220-day ordeal that pushed men and their machines right to the absolute breaking point.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It's like everything that could possibly go wrong did. Just a few days into their trip, they got paranoid and opened fire on British fishing boats, almost starting a whole other war with Great Britain. By the time they limped to Madagascar for supplies, they got the news. Port Arthur, their entire destination, had already been captured by Japan. So morale just hits rock bottom. Their ships are falling apart, the hulls are covered in so much marine life that they can barely move. By the time they finally crawl into the Tsushima Strait, they are in a battle fleet. They're a tragedy waiting to happen.
All right, so the stage is set. You've got the exhausted, beaten-down Russian Navy on one side, and on the other, you've got the super-modern, well-trained, and battle-tested Imperial Japanese Navy basically fighting in their own backyard.
Now, if you just glance at the numbers, you might think Russia has a shot. They've got more heavy battleships. But this table, this tells the real story. The Russian fleet was painfully slow, crawling along at maybe 9 knots because their ships were in such bad shape. The Japanese, they could zip around at over 15 knots. This was like a race between a tortoise and a hare, and that tortoise was about to get into a fight.
As the two fleets finally see each other, the Japanese commander, Admiral Tōgō, raises this now legendary flag signal. For Japan, this was it. This was the whole ballgame. A win meant they were a true world power. Defeat? Unthinkable. Every single sailor on those Japanese ships knew what was at stake. And this is where we see Admiral Tōgō's genius in action. Okay, so picture this. The Russians are steaming ahead in 2 big, clumsy lines. What does Tōgō do? He leads his fleet in this incredibly gutsy U-turn right in front of them. This classic move is called CrossingTheT. It was super risky, but the payoff was huge. Suddenly, the entire Japanese battle line can fire all of their big guns, their full broadside, at the front of the Russian columns. But the Russians? Only their lead ships can shoot back, and only with the few guns they have pointing forward. It was an absolute masterstroke.
So how did this thing turn into one of the most one-sided victories in the history of naval warfare? Well, it wasn't just about clever tactics. Japan had a massive advantage when it came to technology, training, and even what they were shooting.
Let's just run through Japan's toolkit here. They had wireless radios, which let them track the Russians and coordinate perfectly. They had better fire control systems and top-of-the-line British rangefinders, so they could actually hit what they were aiming at from way farther away. And then they had their secret weapon, a brand new type of explosive that was absolutely devastating.
This stuff was called Shimose powder. And here's the key difference. Russian shells were basically big, solid chunks of metal designed to punch through heavy armor. But the Japanese shells filled with the Shimose powder, they were designed to explode the instant they hit anything. So instead of poking holes in a ship, they were basically giant firebombs, tearing apart the upper decks, starting these massive fires, and just shredding everything topside.
And don't just take my word for it. Listen to this from a Russian officer who was right there in the inferno. Shells seemed to be pouring upon us incessantly. I actually watched a steel plate catch fire from a burst. Can you even imagine that? Steel bursting into flames? The Russian ships were literally being burned and dismantled from the top down.
But, you know, it wasn't all about the tech. It never is. You had the human element. The Japanese commanders were hardened veterans, and their crews had trained and drilled for this exact moment. On the Russian side, the admiral had basically zero modern combat experience, leading a crew that was exhausted, demoralized, and totally green. It was a mismatch on every single level.
So what happens when you add all of that up? Well, you don't just get a defeat, you get a slaughter. The final numbers from this battle they're just mind-boggling. Just look at this. Over 5,000 Russian sailors died. 5,000!
The Japanese lost 117 men. That disparity it's almost hard to comprehend. It just shows you how incredibly effective the Japanese gunnery was and how completely the Russian fleet just collapsed.
And the ships? It's even more stark. Russia lost all 11 of its battleships. Every single one was either sunk or captured. The Japanese? They lost 0, not 1. An entire battleship fleet, the pride of the Russian Empire, just gone, wiped from the face of the earth in about a day.
By the next morning, it was all over. The handful of remaining Russian ships were surrounded. Facing certain death for all his men, Rear Admiral Nebagatov made the heartbreaking choice to surrender. And his words to his men, they show this moment of incredible dignity in the middle of a total disaster. He knew the fight was lost, and all he could do was save the lives he had left.
The echoes of Tsushima didn't stop at the water's edge, though. This one single battle sent a shockwave around the world that fundamentally reshaped the 20th century.
Okay, so here's why this battle is so much bigger than just a battle. First, this defeat was so absolute it forced Russia to the negotiating table to end the war. Second, the humiliation back home helped light the fuse for the 1905 Russian Revolution, which nearly toppled the Tsar. Third, Japan bursts onto the world stage as the first modern non-European great power. The old idea that European militaries were just naturally superior shattered. And finally, every navy in the world saw what happened and immediately started a frantic arms race to build bigger, better battleships, the dreadnought race that led us straight towards World War I.
And that leaves us with one last big question. Tsushima was Japan's masterpiece, a victory so perfect, so complete, that it might have planted a dangerous idea in the minds of its leaders, that they were invincible. This one battle created a national legend that would fuel Japanese ambition for the next 40 years, setting them on a path that led to more conquest, but also, ultimately, to the catastrophe of World War II.